Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 76. We rode horseback all around the island of Hawaii, the crooked road making the distance 200 miles, and enjoyed the journey very much. We were more than a week making the trip because our Kanaka horses would not go by a house or a hut without stopping. Whip and spur could not alter their minds about it, and so we finally found that it economized time to let them have their way. Upon inquiry, the mystery was explained. The natives are such thoroughgoing gossips that they never pass a house without stopping to swap news, and consequently their horses learn to regard that sort of thing as an essential part of the whole duty of man, and his salvation not to be compassed without it. However, at a former crisis of my life, I had once taken an aristocratic young lady out driving behind a horse that had just retired from a long and honorable career as the moving impulse of a milk wagon, and so this present experience awoke a reminiscent sadness in me in place of the exasperation more natural to the occasion. I remembered how helpless I was that day and how humiliated, how ashamed I was of having intimated to the girl that I had always owned the horse and was accustomed to grandeur, how hard I tried to appear easy and even vivacious under suffering that was consuming my vitals. How placidly and maliciously the girl smiled and kept on smiling, while my hot blushes baked themselves into a permanent blood pudding in my face. How the horse ambled from one side of the street to the other and waited complacently before every third house 2 minutes and a quarter while I belabored his back and reviled him in my heart. How I tried to keep him from turning corners and failed. How I moved heaven and earth to get him out of town and did not succeed. How he traversed the entire settlement and delivered imaginary milk at 162 different domiciles, and how he finally brought up at a dairy depot and refused to budge further, thus rounding and completing the revealment of what the plebeian service of his life had been. How in eloquent silence I walked the girl home, and how, when I took leave of her, her parting remarks scorched my soul and appeared to blister me all over. She said that my horse was a fine, capable animal, and I must have taken great comfort in him in my time, but that if I would take along some milk tickets next time and appear to deliver them at the various halting places, it might expedite his movements a little. There was a coolness between us after that. In one place, in the island of Hawaii, we saw a laced and ruffled cataract of limpid water leaping from a sheer precipice 1,500 feet high. But that sort of scenery finds its stanchest ally in the arithmetic rather than in spectacular effect. If one desires to be so stirred by a poem of nature wrought in the happily commingled graces of picturesque rocks, glimpsed distances, foliage, color, shifting lights and shadows, and falling water, that the tears almost come into his eyes, so potent is the charm exerted, he need not go away from America to enjoy such an experience. The Rainbow Fall in Watkins Glen, New York, on the Erie Railway is an example. It would recede into pitiable insignificance if the callous tourist drew on arithmetic on it, but left to compete for the honor simply on scenic grace and beauty, the grand, the august, and the sublime being barred the contest. It could challenge the old world and the new to produce its peer. In one locality on our journey, we saw some horses that had been born and reared on top of the mountains, above the range of running water, and consequently they had never drank that fluid in their lives, but had been always accustomed to quenching their thirst by eating dew-laden or shower-wetted leaves. and now it was destructively funny to see them sniff suspiciously at a pail of water and then put in their noses and try to take a bite out of the fluid as if it were a solid. Finding it liquid, they would snatch away their heads and fall to trembling, snorting, and showing other evidences of fright. When they became convinced at last that the water was friendly and harmless, they thrust in their noses up to their eyes, brought out a mouthful of water, and proceeded to chew it complacently. We saw a man coax, kick, and spur one of them 5 or 10 minutes before he could make it cross a running stream. It spread its nostrils, distended its eyes, and trembled all over, just as horses customarily do in the presence of a serpent. And for aught I know, it thought the crawling stream was a serpent. In due course of time, our journey came to an end at Kauai, usually pronounced Toahi, and before we find fault with this elaborate orthographical method of arriving at such an unostentatious result, let us lop off the UGH from our word though. I made this horseback trip on a mule. I paid $10 for him at Kahu. I headed for it to get him shod, rode him 200 miles, and then sold him for $15. I marked the circumstance with a white stone. In the absence of chalk, for I never saw a white stone that a body could mark anything with, though out of respect for the ancients I have tried it often enough. For up to that day and date it was the first strictly commercial transaction I had ever entered to and come out winner. We returned to Honolulu, and from thence sailed to the island of Maui and spent several weeks there very pleasantly. I still remember with a sense of indolent luxury a picnic and excursion up a romantic gorge there called the Io Valley. The trail lay along the edge of a brawling stream in the bottom of the gorge, a shady route, for it was well roofed with the verdant domes of forest trees. Through openings in the foliage we glimpsed picturesque scenery that revealed ceaseless changes and new charms with every step of our progress. Perpendicular walls from 1 to 3,000 feet high guarded the way and were sumptuously plumed with varied foliage in places, and in places swathed in waving ferns. Passing shreds of cloud trailed their shadows across these shining fronts, mottling them with blots. Billowy masses of white vapor hid the turreted summits, and far above the vapor swelled a background of gleaming green crags and cones that came and went through the veiling mists like islands drifting in a fog. Sometimes the cloudy curtain descended till half the canyon wall was hidden, then shredded gradually away till only airy glimpses of the ferny front appeared through it, then swept aloft and left it glorified in the sun again. Now and then, as our position changed, rocky bastions swung out from the wall, a mimic ruin of castellated ramparts and crumbling towers clothed with mosses and hung with garlands of swaying vines, and as we moved on, they swung back again and hid themselves once more in the foliage. Presently, a verdure-clad needle of stone 1,000 feet high stepped out from behind a corner and mounted guard over the mysteries of the valley. It seemed to me that if Captain Cook needed a monument, here was one ready-made. Therefore, why not put up his sign here and sell out the venerable coconut stump? But the chief pride of Maui is her dead volcano of Haleakala, which means, when translated, the house of the sun. We climbed 1,000 feet up the side of this isolated colossus one afternoon, then camped, and next day climbed the remaining 9,000 feet and anchored on the summit, where we built a fire and froze and roasted by turns all night. With the first pallor of dawn, we got up and saw things that were new to us. Mounted on a commanding pinnacle, we watched nature work her silent wonders. The sea was spread abroad on every hand. its tumbled surface seeming only wrinkled and dimpled in the distance. A broad valley below appeared like an ample checkerboard, its velvety green sugar plantations alternating with dun squares of barrenness and groves of trees diminished to mossy tufts. Beyond the valley were mountains picturesquely grouped together, but bear in mind we fancied that we were looking up at these things, not down. We seemed to sit in the bottom of a symmetrical bowl 10,000 feet deep, with the valley and the skirting sea lifted away into the sky above us. It was curious, and not only curious, but aggravating, for it was having our trouble all for nothing to climb 10,000 feet toward heaven and then have to look up at our scenery. However, we had to be content with it and make the best of it. For all we could do, we could not coax our landscape down out of the clouds. Formerly, when I had read an article in which Poe treated of this singular fraud perpetrated upon the eye by oscillated great altitudes, I had looked upon the matter as an invention of his own fancy. I have spoken of the outside view, but we had an inside one, too. That was the yawning, dead crater into which we now and then tumbled rocks half as large as a barrel from our perch, and saw them go careering down the almost perpendicular sides, bounding 300 feet at a jump, kicking up gas clouds wherever they struck, diminishing to our view as they sped farther into distance, growing invisible finally, and only betraying their course by faint little puffs of dust, and coming to a halt at last in the bottom of the abyss 2,500 feet down from where they started. It was magnificent sport. We wore ourselves out at it. The crater of Vesuvius, as I have before remarked, is a modest pit about 1,000 feet deep and 3,000 in circumference. That of Kilauea is somewhat deeper and 10 miles in circumference. But what are either of them compared to the vacant stomach of Haleakala? I will not offer any figures of my own, but give official ones, those of Commander Wilkes, U.S.N., who surveyed it and testifies that it is 27 miles in circumference. If it had a level bottom, it would make a fine sight for a city like London. It must have afforded a spectacle worth contemplating in the old days when its furnaces gave full rein to their anger. Presently, vagrant white clouds came drifting along high over the sea and the valley. Then they came in couples and groups, then in imposing squadrons. Gradually joining their forces, they banked themselves solidly together 1,000 feet under us and totally shut out land and ocean. Not a vestige of anything was left in view, but just a little of the rim of the crater, circling away from the pinnacle whereon we sat. For a ghostly procession of wanderers from the filmy hosts without had drifted through a chasm in the crater wall and filed round and gathered and sunk and blended together till the abyss was stored to the brim with a fleecy fog. Thus banked, motion ceased and silence reigned. Clear to the horizon, league on league, the snowy floor stretched without a break. Not level, but in rounded folds, with shallow creases between, and with here and there stately piles of vapory architecture lifting themselves aloft out of the common plain. Some near at hand, some in the middle distances, and others relieving the monotony of the remote solitudes. There was little conversation, for the impressive scene overawed speech. I felt like the last man neglected of the judgment and left pinnacled in mid-heaven, a forgotten relic of a vanished world. While the hush yet brooded, the messengers of the coming resurrection appeared in the east. A growing warmth suffused the horizon, and soon the sun emerged and looked out over the cloud waste, flinging bars of ruddy light across it, staining its folds and billycaps with blushes, purpling the shaded troughs between them, and glorifying the massive vapor palaces and cathedrals with the wasteful splendor of all blendings and combinations of rich coloring. It was the sublimest spectacle I ever witnessed, and I think the memory of it will remain with me always.